So as you know, our children are doing summer vacation Bible school, and so we are doing our own version, which is our Summer Faith series, our adult vacation Bible school, so to speak, and we started it last week. And our theme for the next couple weeks is, who is Jesus? All right? Who is Jesus? Last week we talked about, C.S. Lewis said you can talk about Jesus in three ways, and then Father Jason added a fourth. Jesus either is a liar, meaning he knew he wasn't God, but yet he proclaimed he was. Jesus was a lunatic. He really believed he was God, but he really wasn't. Father Jason's third, legend. That's what we're going to kind of talk about today. That we can't really get to the historical Jesus. It was really decades after his passion, death, and resurrection. The kind of church kind of formulated all this stuff about his deity, but that we really need to get back to the historical Jesus. Or fourth, he is Lord. Liar, lunatic, legend, or Lord. Those are your four options when you look at Jesus. I want to talk about legend. Last night, which is why I'm drowsy and red-eyed, I was with the youth group and all kinds of other Harry Potter fans, picking up another canonical gospel known as Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, right? So, when I get this book, I hear it's written by J.K. Rowling, but how do I know it is? Do you ever think about that? When you get a book from an author, how do you know that's the author who wrote the book? Well, one, her name's slapped all over it. Okay? It's called internal evidence. Really big. J.K. Rowling. If I look in the back, her picture's slapped in it too, right? With a biography. So internally, when I look at the book, I know that this book was written by J.K. Rowling because her name's on it, her name's in it. But how do I still know that it's written by her? Second part is external evidence. Okay? By the way, this is a play that was actually put in the book, so it's not like the other one, so there's a couple helpers, but we're just not going to talk about them for the sake of argumentation. But they're on here too. External evidence. People who know J.K. Yes, she wrote that book. Oh, I know her. Oh, yeah, she talked to me about ideas for this book. Her publicist, her PR people. These are external evidence to say that she wrote this book. So we know that J.K. wrote this book, Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, because internal evidence, her name's slapped all over it, and external evidence, a lot of people who know her also say she wrote the book. So what in the world does this have to do with Jesus? Legend. If you turn on CNN, the History Channel, anytime around Christmas or Easter, you see all kinds of garbage about Jesus. And the one things they'll try to say, and many different things they'll say, really, the Gospels are written anonymously for the most part. And it was decades later that their disciples or their churches put names such as Matthew or John on these documents to give them more credence. There's also a theory called the Q theory that says there was kind of this anonymous document that was kind of the foundation, and then they built the Gospels off that. You see, people in trying to attack the understanding of Jesus as God and everything that Jesus says, you got to get to his evidence. And what's the evidence? First and foremost, it's the Gospels. So if you can underpin the Gospels and take the foundation out from the Gospels, then the rest of the house falls. So a lot of those accounts that you see in Christmas and Easter start with that premise to try to destroy the authenticity of the Gospels and the authorship of the Gospels. But is that stuff true? Remember, part of this Summer Faith series is to equip you to understand these things. In your bulletins, you will see your little handout. Just as our kids get handouts for Vacation Bible School, you do too. So pull out your handouts. Can we trust the authorship of the Gospels? So just like we did with this Harry Potter book, let's look at the internal evidence. Her name slapped all over it. The fascinating thing about church archaeology and history is there is not one papyrus, there is not one document, there is not one sliver of paper of the four Gospels that doesn't have the evangelist Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John's name on it. Just like every book of the Harry Potter and the Cursed Child that just came out last night has JK on it, every piece of historical evidence that we have of the Gospels has their name on it. Now, sometimes there's titles that are different. Like some say the Gospel according to Matthew, others say according to Matthew. But the fact of the matter is their names are slapped all over it. There is not one anonymous gospel. There's not one piece of evidence. There's not one papyrus. There's nothing. The quote-unquote famous Q source that I mentioned is fiction. People are going to love that on YouTube. It's fiction. There's no documentation. There's no history. There is no such thing as a non-authored gospel, because even the earliest evidence we have has the names of 4 people written on them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And who are they? Take a look at your sheets. Matthew, I believe, was the first gospel that was written. Matthew was a tax collector. That would have been very scandalous for Jesus to choose an apostle who was a tax collector. But for the sake of argumentation, it makes an interesting point. Because out of all the apostles, he was the one who was literate. Tax collectors had to read and tax collectors had to write. Why? For purposes of tax receipts, legal contracts, licenses, and personal letters. Matthew had to read and write for his job. It makes sense, therefore, as he's walking with Jesus in this ministry, he probably was jotting stuff down. That's Matthew. Eyewitness, apostle, tax collector. 2, Mark. Who's Mark? Mark's a companion of St. Paul. When you read some of the letters of St. Paul, and especially the Acts of the Apostles, sometimes he's listed as John Mark. Mark probably was fairly wealthy, at least came from a wealthy family. He also was a disciple of Peter. So he really takes to Peter and goes with Peter to Rome. Mark was very well known in the Roman church, the first century Roman church. Okay? Listen to what St. Peter says in his first letter. By Silvanus, a faithful brother as I regard him, I have written briefly to you. Pause. For the sake of our argumentation here, if you notice, what does that mean? Peter couldn't read or write. So he had Silvanus be his secretary. By the way, the understanding of Peter as a poor fisherman, Peter's this old guy with a stick in the River Galilee, right? It's not accurate. When you go to Peter's house in Capernaum that was excavated, his house in Capernaum has many rooms. What does that mean? That means he wasn't poor. He was a fisherman and probably owned a fishing business and had people working underneath of him. Possibly Silvanus. But Silvanus is writing this letter on behalf of Peter. I have written briefly to you, exhorting and declaring that this is the true grace of God. Stand fast in it. She who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, the church. And so does my son Mark. Mark the evangelist. You all call me Father Jason, right? It's evident in the scriptures, especially between the letters of Peter and some of the things of Paul, especially his letter to Timothy, that they called people back son. You might have had some old priest back in the day say son or daughter to you. It's kind of that same thing. It's that deep relationship. But this shows that Mark was a disciple of Peter. Okay? Not an eyewitness to the Gospels, but someone who knew the eyewitness. Who was the eyewitness? Peter. Luke. Luke is a doctor, physician. Luke is a historian. Luke is also a companion of Paul. So when you read Acts of the Apostles, Luke is running around with Paul. So Mark is running around with Peter. Luke is running around with Paul. Probably not an eyewitness like the apostles were, but someone who knew. Look at Luke, what he tells us in chapter 1. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have been accomplished among us, just as they were delivered to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write carefully in order for you, the most excellent Theophilus, probably his benefactor, that you may know the facts concerning the things of which you have been informed. So he tells us he wasn't an eyewitness, but what's he doing? He is with Paul. And where's Paul going? Paul's taking cruises all over the Mediterranean, right? He's up and down and all over the place. He's hitting churches. And what is Luke probably doing? Luke is listening to him preach. Luke is interviewing people, most especially the Blessed Mother. The Annunciation story would have been dictated to the church by Mary because she was the only one there other than Gabriel. Probably comes from an interview with Luke. Fourth evangelist, John. Fisherman. Possibly could have worked in Peter's fishing company, right? He is an apostle. He refers to himself in the gospel as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Look what he says in John 21. Peter turned and saw following them the disciple whom Jesus loved, who had lain close to his breast at the supper, and said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? This is the disciple who is bearing witness to these things, and who had written these things. And we know that his testimony is true. He probably couldn't read or write. He had someone else write the gospel for him as he preached it. So we have four evangelists whose names are splattered on every ancient papyrus. Matthew, an apostle and tax collector. Mark, a companion disciple of Peter, not an eyewitness, but someone who was listening to Peter. Luke, companion of Paul, someone who's listening to the preachings of Paul and interviewing early members of the church. And John, the apostle. So our internal evidence, because if you notice, this all comes from the New Testament, just as J.K. Rowling's name is splattered on the front and her biography is in the back, in the Gospels, the names of the evangelists are splattered all over the front, and their names are all in it. What about external evidence? Go to the back page. These are writings from they're called the early church fathers and mothers. These are the early teachers, bishops, priests, nuns of the church. And if you notice, all four of these quotes are before the year 200. Matthew, Irenaeus of Lyon, 180. Matthew published among the Hebrews a written gospel, also in their own tongue, while Peter and Paul were preaching in Rome and founding the church. Matthew's gospel was originally composed in Hebrew and then translated into Greek. This is in 180, bearing witness that he wrote it. Papias of Hierapolis, 130 AD, in regards to Mark. I love this because I think this shows what Peter's personality was. The elder John used to say this: Mark, having become Peter's interpreter, wrote down accurately everything he remembered, though not in order, of the things either said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward, as I said, followed Peter, who adapted his teachings as needed and had no intention of giving an ordered account of what the Lord was saying. Consequently, Mark did nothing wrong in writing down some things as he remembered them, for he made it his one concern not to omit anything that he heard or make any false statement in them. What does that say? Peter never intended to write a gospel. Peter never intended of giving an ordered account of the Lord's thing. But what is Mark doing? Writing down Peter's sermons. And you could just heard that conversation between Peter and Mark. Why are you writing down what I'm saying? Just listen to what I'm saying. No, I got to write it down. People are going to need this. Okay? Luke, Irenaeus of Lyon, 180. Luke also, who was a follower of Paul, put down in a book the gospel which was preached to him. John, Clement of Alexandria, 200 AD. Of all those who had been with the Lord, only Matthew and John left us their recollections and traditions, says that they took into writing perforce. John, it is said, used all the time a message which was not written down, and at last took to writing for the following cause. The three gospels which had been written down before were distributed to all, including himself. That means Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written before John, and John had a copy of all of them. It is said he welcomed them, testified to their truth, but said that there was only lacking to the narrative the account what was done by Christ at first and at the beginning of the preaching. The wedding feast of Cana, for example, is only in John, which happened right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. They say accordingly that John was asked to relate in his own gospel the period passed over in silence by the former evangelists. So we have internal evidence of the writings of papyrus of all four of the evangelists, and also stuff in the actual text itself. We have external evidence, if you think about J.K. Rowling's publicists, who say these are the guys that wrote the Gospels. And when you compare the Gospels to ancient historical biographies at the time, they are almost identical. If you think of the life of Josephus, life of various Caesars, things of that nature, they almost run just like the Gospel does. The birth narrative is very short or non-existent, or begins with a genealogy. That's why we only hear the infancy narratives in Luke and a little bit in Matthew, and there's genealogies in Luke and Matthew. The largest chunk of the Gospels is the person's active public life. So it is with ancient biographies. And the ancient biographies deal with the person's death. So does the Gospels. Ancient historical biographies between 10,000 and 2,000 in words. Luke was 18,000. It's the longest gospel. The shortest gospel is Mark at 11,000. It fits right in with ancient biographies. The accounts were never meant to be put in order. They never were for any other ancient historical biography. And they never told you the totality of the person, just the important stuff. I believe the Gospels were written by these four men, probably before 70 AD, but that's a whole nother homily, attested to by the early church. And they work like historical biographies. What's the whole point of this? To understand who Jesus is, most of the evidence is contained in scriptures, especially the Gospels. And you can trust the authenticity of the Gospels just based on archaeology. That's awesome. That's awesome when you stop and think about it. What you just heard Deacon Diana preach comes from Mark. Did it come from Mark today? Luke, who got information from firsthand accounts of the life of Jesus. That's powerful stuff. Next week, we're going to look at actually what he said in those Gospels, because we can believe the Gospels are historically accurate. The next part is believing if what Jesus said was either a liar, a lunatic, or Lord.